history and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View. And first of all, I want to say thank you to Liberty McCarter, sitting here yesterday and organizing and running the Next Generation podcast and discussion and roundtable, all sorts of things that came out of that discussion, which we will probably get to a little bit later. She'll be joining me, I guess, by phone on Friday, along with Dr. Merle Matthews. But today we're going to spend some time, first of all, getting into a couple of the issues in the news, as well as we'll be talking at the bottom of the hour with Dr. Carl Trueman. We've had him on before as we've talked about some of his books which relate to the sexual revolution. As a matter of fact, the booklet I have on sex and culture recommends two of his books, which we'll get into, but he's going to be joining us because I saw a very good article by him about what is a human being anyway. Takes us back to Psalm 8, what is man that thou art mindful of him? And I think he's done a very good job of reminding us how that is so pivotal, not only in terms of gender and sexuality issues, but in terms of, well, everything from civil rights to human rights to even, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, artificial intelligence. So we'll get into that with him at the bottom of the hour. Next hour, we'll get into the conversation with Todd Nettleton, and we'll talk about the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church. He's got a video that you may want to watch, as well as we'll just try to get an update on some very important issues that we are certainly going to be covering, but the mainstream press has failed to cover, so we'll get into that as well. Lots of things to cover, but I thought we'd start out with something just sort of fun, but is significant, and that is the editors, the Wall Street Journal, talk about the university elite reconsidered. Now, what they've done is pointed out that we used to have a definition for what an elite university is, and I think a lot of us that for years subscribed to U.S. News and World Report knew that they did these traditional college rankings. But our friends at the Manhattan Institute went back and said, wait a minute, there are some different ways that you can evaluate universities. And as I've said before, these rankings are dependent upon what you consider or what you ignore. And they decided to assess universities, for example, on a lot of qualities that students and their families are concerned about. That would be things like, free speech, how it approaches politics on the campus, how successful are the students when they graduate from that university, and what do the students think about their teachers? Do liberal arts schools present students with a core curriculum? Do they even require a course in U.S. history or government to graduate? Are they just riven with DEI, woke kinds of ideas? And using that evaluation, they give us a very different kind of list. So first of all, you might want to go to that first article. If you are thinking about going to a college next year, if you know a young person, maybe it's your son, daughter, niece, nephew, maybe even next door neighbor thinking about a college. Obviously, if you're a Christian, you want to think about the Christian colleges, but we're looking at the, if you will, public institutions. What I thought was so interesting is the top 10 American colleges or universities. Are you ready? We probably need a drum roll here, but you get the idea. Number 1, University of Florida. Number 2, University of Texas at Austin. Number 3, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Number 4, Texas A&M. Number 5, University of Notre Dame. Number 6, Georgia Institute of Technology. Number 7, Florida State University. Number 8, Purdue University, main campus. Number 9, University of Georgia. Number 10, Clemson. Now, for those of you keeping score at home, that is 2 universities in Florida. That's 2 universities in Texas. That's 2 universities in Georgia and 2 universities in Indiana. with one in North Carolina and one in South Carolina. What is so intriguing to me is we broadcast all over the nation, but we're not in every state, but we're in all those states that are mentioned. And it is, I think, also interesting that these are what you would consider to be red states, right? I mean, I know Georgia doesn't look like a red state right now with their 2 U.S. senators, but I think that's going to change pretty soon. Look at number 1, University of Florida. Does anybody remember who the recent president of the University of Florida was? Well, that would be Ben Sasse. He was your senator from Nebraska who left the U.S. Senate to be the professor and the president. I think he was the 13th president there at the University of Florida. University of Texas at Austin. You go down Texas A&M, and, really in the top 4, 2 of those are in the state of Texas. No real surprise because, again, the regents there work real hard to make sure that too much silliness doesn't surface there. And then, of course, for our friends in Georgia, Georgia Institute of Technology and University of Georgia. Notre Dame is on there because, as I have certainly learned over the years, they work really hard to make sure that when you graduate, you will get a job. And that's something that they are notorious for. And so if you look at that, you see that these are, I think, very significant. And what you also notice, even though I've been to some of these schools, no Ivy League school made the top 10. Let's get on to a couple. University of Pennsylvania was in the top 20. And then you've got, where I have to look it down here, Princeton, 24, Yale, 30, Columbia, 34, Harvard, 37. And the point they're making is this. The definition of elite education has been undergoing a revision of late as top universities from Harvard to Columbia to Northwestern have too often betrayed their commitment to free inquiry on campus, and this new ranking system is something to consider. And so again, we will certainly acknowledge that, of course, U.S. News and World Report looks at other things, test scores, selectivity of admissions, and the rest. But when we think about what we would want to achieve with our students, our friends, neighbors, coworkers, children going off to school, this, I thought, was a much more interesting rating system, and it's our first article. Again, some of you may just make a wise decision. You don't need to go to college at all. Right now here in the state of Texas, one of the provisions we're going to vote on in about 2 weeks is about trade schools. And we've talked about that before and plan to do that again. But if you are going to college, well, first of all, think about some of the Christian schools that are really Christian in their teaching. And then, of course, if you want to get an education that's going to require science, engineering, those kinds of things, some Christian schools are good at that. Most aren't really equipped for that. You might want to think some of these public universities, but it just reminds us that, sure, we recognize that some of these elite schools have done very well in terms of academic performance, but they have fallen behind when it comes to things like free speech and protecting the rights of Christian students. Anti-Semitism has been an issue, and a variety of others. So I just thought you might want to look at that. This is about the time of year when young people are starting to think about where they might go off to college, and that's our first article on the website at pointofview.net. 3 cheers for the Manhattan Institute for using, I think, a better set of criteria to evaluate some of these elite universities. Let's take a break. When we come back, some comments about artificial intelligence that we all need to know about. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A new study of marijuana is in the news, and since we dislike people who tell you, "I told you so," I'll merely remind radio listeners that we've had this conversation before. The editors of the Wall Street Journal write that marijuana users are crash dummies. They cite research from Wright State University that analyzed driver autopsy results of car crashes. More than 4 in 10 tested positive for THC, the active ingredient in marijuana, with an average level of 30 nanograms. This is more than 6 times the level most states use to define impairment. As you may already know, breathalyzers used by law enforcement don't detect recent marijuana use. That makes it difficult for police to catch a person who is driving while high. The editors also remind us of the fact that today's marijuana is 5 times more potent than the weed that boomers smoked when they were young. The editors also mention that auto fatalities have increased over the last decade, even as cars have become safer and alcohol consumptions have fallen. You might want to look at the individual states and find what appears to be a correlation. As I've mentioned in previous commentaries, just as various governments are rushing to legalize and thus increase marijuana use, we're also learning more of its dangers. A decade ago, when I had a reporter on my program who documented the link between cannabis and schizophrenia, I received many complaints from the audience. Now the National Institute of Health is reporting the same connection. A rational society would debate both the pros and cons of a policy. Unfortunately, the negative concerns about marijuana use are mounting up, and yet few seem to be paying attention. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation a little bit later, we'll open up the phones, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just mention that we're going to move on to this issue of AI and artificial intelligence, but I thought I might just mention one other thing. When we look at these particular top 10 American colleges and universities, I talked about, of course, some of the presidents. I mentioned one, for example, University of Florida, Ben Sasse, but in addition to the fact that there are red states in which there is maybe a little more of a hands-off idea, less pursuing of woke ideas. Let's also acknowledge that in many cases, the governors had a reason to be giving them some credit as well. Ron DeSantis, for example, in Florida, it's not just Ron DeSantis, but it was Christopher Rufo and others that were working with the different board members. You can think of Brian Kemp in Georgia. You can think of Greg Abbott in Texas. So there are a lot of reasons why, as the Manhattan Institute evaluated these colleges and universities, they put 2 from Florida, 2 from Texas, 2 from Georgia, 2 from Indiana, 1 from North Carolina, 1 from South Carolina, all red states, and it maybe tells you something as well. But let's move on to the next article, because I wanted to certainly focus some time and attention on artificial intelligence. I'll hold up my booklet on artificial intelligence, which is hard to believe. It's 2 years old, and as we said, we're probably going to update it. As a matter of fact, I'll give you a preview. We already are starting to work on the January issue of Outlook, and that will be focused on the subject of artificial intelligence. And as we point out, strengths, weaknesses, pros and cons. This particular article is mostly pro, and I want to try to be balanced as we get into this. And a lot of it talks about what's called Wright's Law. You might say, okay, what's that all about? Back in 1930s, an aeronautical engineer, Theodore Wright, discovered that, and this should be obvious to us now, that costs fell in a predictable way every time production doubled. The more you produce, the cheaper things become. But it's not just because the cost of some of those things lowers. It's also because there's a learning cost that declines. So essentially, this article that appeared also in the Wall Street Journal says scale drives efficiency. For almost a century now, industrial planners have relied on this simple principle known as Wright's Law. So you say, very good. But it turns out now that artificial intelligence has dramatically accelerated this principle. It is, as they said, rewriting Wright's Law, which assumes that experience follows production. In other words, you make some mistakes, you learn from them and improve. In his early days, my father worked primarily in factories where they were producing, actually in this case, pharmaceuticals. Later he went to work for Pfizer, but at the time it was sometimes you would make a mistake here and you'd learn for that, or somebody would say, you know, if we did this differently on the particular line in which we're producing some of this, we would have more efficiency. So you would expect that over time, experience, when applied to production, would make you more efficient. And that's just sort of intuitive knowledge, but the Wright's Law put that in some kind of quantitative way. And we recognize that human knowledge, oftentimes, we take for granted all the things we do correctly today, but sometimes it took decades of human trial and error, weeks, days, whatever, and so as a result, you were able to improve what's called the supply chain. Okay, enter artificial intelligence. It is, as they said, breaking Wright's Law because the learning cycle is no longer physical, but computational. Distribution models can test, fail, and improve millions of times faster than a team of human engineers. Experience can be generated in advance, at scale, and at negligible cost. They say then the result is even more powerful because once you then add to that, are you ready for this? Robotics, sensors, geospatial intelligence, and cloud computing, this thing is really on hyperdrive. And so as a result, we can produce things faster. Okay, where's the drawback? One is what is missing. The missing ingredient is wisdom. Oh, there we go. Computers aren't known for wisdom. And as they point out, data without context is noise. The future belongs to systems that can combine raw computational power with judgment, pattern recognition, and domain expertise. And you might say, well, that's why we need humans. Yes, but in some respects, really what we're talking about is now AI, artificial intelligence, is so much more sophisticated. We're creating what we call AI savants, specialized systems which are rapidly evolving and can actually inject some wisdom into the system. When these AI savants are infused with the experience of seasoned professionals, innovation cycles collapse even further. Now, the implications of this are, first of all, pretty extraordinary. Supply chains may stop behaving like managed systems, and they say may start functioning more kind of like adaptive organisms, like an organism out there in the world of nature. AI agents will negotiate, reroute, and optimize flows of goods in real time. Traditional ownership models, fleets, warehouses, even labor could be displaced by dynamic orchestration of perfectly used assets. If you've ever taken the time to read some books, and I admit to have read one or two, about the complexity of supply chains, you would certainly recognize how AI would be helpful there. Even if you've never read any of these books, can you remember how the supply chains broke during the pandemic and the lockdown? For a while, we were all scrambling for toilet paper, and we'd go into the store and we'd see an overabundance of a product that nobody wanted, and it was not working very well. Well, again, as they say, winners won't be the companies that move the most freight. Winners will be those that control the richest data streams, that build and deploy AI savants that embrace the new reality rather than clinging to outdated assumptions about scale. Now, entire categories, and this gets into another negative, categories of jobs may disappear far more quickly than in the past cycles of creative destruction. And we have certainly recognized that with any new technological advance, whether it was electricity, whether it's the production of steel, whether it's computational power. I've written a booklet on that, on historical cycles. We see that it takes place usually over many years, even a decade. This could happen a lot faster. And so again, it says for all its dangers, they recognize that it could eliminate whole categories of jobs, but then try to inject just a little bit of optimism because they say for all its dangers, the elimination of entire categories of jobs may produce a flourishing of entrepreneurial activity. We may see nimble companies in numbers never seen before, each rising quickly, taking advantage of low cost of building businesses and distributed access to tools and sunsetting as fast as they don't solve problems for customers. But the bottom line they're making is very simple. The so-called rights law still matters, but AI has broken it, and AI is destroying kind of the old learning curve. So if you are hearing about artificial intelligence and you're thinking, well, that's in the future, some of these AI savants are here right now. More and more companies are developing it, and more countries are racing ahead to try to use it the most effective way. And so you're in the midst of some of the most significant change that is taking place. Hence, again, why in a future Outlook magazine, you'll be able to read about all sorts of aspects of artificial intelligence. And if you aren't already receiving that Outlook magazine, well, it's an easy way to receive it. Your monthly gift of any size will give you that magazine. And, of course, your gift of at least $1 a day, $30 a month or more, $360 a year, would give you the booklets. And I'm sure once we do the Outlook magazine, we'll pull some of that together in one of these booklets. So these are the kind of benefits we want to give to you as we live on the edge of some remarkable changes taking place in the 21st century. These are the things I think Christians should be talking about, and that's why we're talking about them right here on Point of View. If you'd like to find some of the articles I've already mentioned, they're on the website, pointofview.net. My Viewpoints commentary today is about marijuana, and you can read all about that and some of the latest studies. Our Take Action item, prevent government shutdowns. Yes, we still have a government shutdown. Can you believe it? And when we come back, we're going to spend some time talking with Dr. Carl Trueman, a professor of biblical and religious studies at Grove City College, individual with his doctorate from the University of Aberdeen. An individual who's written some really good books, and I think a very interesting article about what it means to be a human being. We'll come back with more right after this.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Going to spend some time talking about what it means to be a human being, and you might even turn to Psalm 8, because in some respects we're going to try to provide some perspective in that regard, because we're going to be talking, as I just mentioned a minute ago, with Dr. Carl Trueman. If that name is familiar, you might remember that we've done interviews with him in the past on his book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Cultural Amnesia and Expressive Individualism and the Road to Sexual Revolution. Then later, 2 years later, the book Strange New World, How Thinkers and Activists Redefine Identity and Spark the Sexual Revolution. Very similar books, one shorter than the other. But some of you say, well, is there a way to maybe get the essence of him? And I'll hold up the booklet I did just about 2 years ago, and it's entitled Sex and Culture, A Biblical View on Sex and Culture, in which I quote extensively from Carl Trueman, in part because I think he is such a seminal thinker, an individual that we've talked with and even talked about on this program in the past. But the other day at World Magazine, noticed that he had written a piece, several books that shaped my thinking, what is a human being anyway. The first two were familiar to me, but the others were not. And I thought, well, some people accuse me when I do these book interviews of increasing their expenses in buying new books. Well, he's done the same for me. But I thought maybe he could come in, as he's been looking at this whole area of what you might call biblical anthropology. What does it mean to be a human being? And that question, of course, relates to the bioethics issue. Just a few minutes ago, we were talking about artificial intelligence. I think it relates to that. Civil rights, human rights, and all those. Once you get right your view of human nature, I think a lot of things fall into place. Dr. Carl Trueman is the professor of biblical and religious studies at Grove City College, contributed editor to First Things, where I read him sometimes as well. Also a fellow with the Ethics and Public Policy Center. I mentioned a few of his books. And Dr. Carl Trueman, welcome back to Point of View.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me on, Kerby.
Might just mention again, PhD from University of Aberdeen. And you start off with one that hopefully would be more familiar to our listeners, and that is Augustine and the Confessions. But let's talk about that, because you have really sort of delved into this issue, because much of your writing has dealt with the sexual revolution and gender issues and, of course, in vitro fertilization, surrogacy. All sorts of these issues really bring us back to understanding what it means to be a human being.
Yeah, I think it's the pressing question of our age in many ways, and actually provides a great opportunity for Christians, because the questions that our non-Christian neighbors and even the high hegions of the wider culture are asking come back to what it means to be a human being. And to that question, one has to give a theological answer. One can reject Christian theology, but you can't answer the question of what it means to be a human being without also wrestling with the question of, does God exist? Who is God? So I think it's the pressing question of our day, and it's a great moment for Christians to gear themselves up to be able to give an account of the hope that is within them, to quote the New Testament. And Augustine, I think, is critical to that. His Confessions is a marvelous, it's cast as one long prayer to God, but also brings out so beautifully the fact that human beings from a Christian perspective are those made in God's image and are therefore dependent upon and obliged to God. And that strikes hard at the great modern myth that human beings are created as autonomous, self-directed, and self-governing creatures.
Well, again, you point out that Augustine's doctrine of God decisively informs his doctrine of man, providing one of the propulsive aspects of the narrative, and then point out that along the way, his criticism of the pornography of the gladiator shows and some of the others give us insight. And we may not have gladiator shows, but we do have pornography. We do have a rising tide of violence. Matter of fact, my most recent booklet is on political violence, and we will be addressing that so much in the future. And it does seem to me that if you start with the assumption there is no God, then every individual that you're dealing with is a result of mass, energy, chance, and time. So why should we even be concerned about what is right and wrong, because there's no standard? But if we start from the assumption that there is a God, then there's a standard, and there are certain things you can do with human beings and certain things you cannot do with human beings.
Yes, if you start with the view there's no God, then ultimately I think however much you try to maintain the fact that other human beings have value, you will ultimately tend, or your culture will ultimately tend in a direction that treats human beings as things or as objects,
yes,
as lumps of animated matter. And that, of course, allows you to justify pornography. What is pornography? It's looking at human beings engaged in sexual activity as if they're things there for you to consume. It justifies violence. Other human beings, they're people, they're things that get in your way of you realizing your own desires and ambitions. It's only when we ground our view of other people in the fact that they, like us, are made, they're persons, if you like, because they're made in the image of God, that we can have any sort of social ethics that treats them as persons or subjects and not as things.
And again, I might just mention that's for the section on Augustinian anthropology, or Augustine's Confessions. Let's move on, though, to Blaise Pascal and pensées. We've talked about that quite a bit with Doug Groothuis. Dr. Doug Groothuis has, of course, done his doctorate on that. But this one, you call it Wrestling with Modernity, and that is Blaise Pascal's thoughts, or how to think about the kind of the modern world, I think is, again, an important issue, because this world that we find ourselves is more like what Pascal faced than what, say, Augustine faced. And so you believe that also as one of these classic works that might help inform our view of human nature.
Yes, I think Pascal was very much one of the founders of modernity in many ways. He was a brilliant scientist. And one of the things that Pascal's scientific explorations did, it was paradoxical really, led him to his own brilliance and his own, if you like, measuring and analysis of the universe, led him to this acute sense of his own insignificance. I think one of the challenges for us in modernity is, we're exceptional creatures. No other creature reflects upon their own existence. Hamsters don't reflect upon what it means to be a hamster.
Yes.
Human beings do. But the strange thing is that unique brilliance we have tilts us towards thinking of ourselves as insignificant and nothing at all. And you mentioned artificial intelligence at the start, great example. Only human beings can develop artificial intelligence. And ironically, our development of that is raising acute questions of, human beings, are we going to make ourselves redundant? Are we going to have any meaning or value in the near future? So Pascal is one who really, I think, is one of the early Christian thinkers who puts his finger on that problem. And the second thing he does, he lives in a very materialist society, 17th century France.
Mm-hmm.
And his analysis of the way desire for material possessions and an absolute fear of human limitations, particularly death, drives so much of how we think. I think that too is a very insightful thing that Pascal lays out in some ways more beautifully than anyone before or since.
And again, one other thing I thought I'd pick up just real quickly is because he was in that culture, there was an entertainment obsession. Why does the king have a jester? Well, that may have been somewhat of a question in the 17th century. How about the 21st century? How many people could survive without their cell phone for a day? How many have to be entertained every moment of the day? I think in some respects, that question, which was sort of part of the 17th century question, is really relevant in the 21st century, don't you think?
Absolutely. When you think of who gets paid the most in society, now regardless of what you think of any particular senator or president at any given point in time, they get paid peanuts compared to professional basketball players or professional football players. And with the best will in the world, we've got to say that the President of the United States or a senator does a more important job than somebody playing a schoolyard game in a big stadium. And yet we don't complain about basketball players taking home tens of millions of dollars Well, that's because they actually do something more important than the president. They keep us entertained. They distract us from the nasty, brutish, short nature of human life.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, two more. The Theology of the Body and The Purpose of Gender. You may have heard those first two books. These next three are more contemporary, but they're ones that you need to know about as well. And certainly, I think you will benefit from this article, which, again, you can find at World Magazine, but we have posted it on our website at pointofview.net, and you can learn about how, again, Carl Trueman benefited from those books, and you can learn more about those books, all available at the website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us for a few more minutes Dr. Carl Trueman. And again, the article is What is a Human Being Anyway? It appeared in the September issue of World Magazine. And if you already have that, you can be following along. But if not, we have a post on this website at pointofview.net. Two more, The Theology of the Body, and then in just a minute, The Purpose of Gender. The two books that you mentioned for The Theology of the Body, The Rights of Women and What It Means to Be Human, one dealing with feminism, the other dealing with the bioethics of conception, birth, and death. And neither of those books probably are familiar to most of us, although near the end you do kind of add a footnote of C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. But in here, you're using two very different books to help us think again about the theology of the body. And of course, we've had Nancy Piercy on talking about that in her book. But this section, again, was, again, insightful because you're quoting feminists or a critique of feminism and then the whole issue of what it means to be human.
Yeah, the two writers are Erica Bakioki and Carter Sneed. Erica is a legal scholar at the Abigail Adams Institute, and Carter is a professor at the University of Notre Dame. And what they do in their works different. Erica's a legal scholar. Carter Sneed is a bioethicist. What they do is they argue that fundamental to any thinking in their fields, law and bioethics, about what it means to be human, fundamental is the fact that we are embodied creatures, and bodies come with limits. Mm-hmm. We are mortal. We have natural obligations towards others. Erica is particularly good on, how do you think about women's rights if you take the body seriously? Well, most feminists typically see the female body as a problem. That's why we have abortion. They get pregnant, that's a natural bodily function. So we've got to somehow terminate the pregnancy, overcome the natural limit of the body. Erica's argument really is no, we need to accept the female body as what it is, and we need to build our understanding, for example, of women's rights around the legal enshrining of those things that need to be in place so the woman can fulfill her obligations, for example, to the children that she produces. So she's taking the body seriously. And Carter does very much the same when he's talking about reproduction, for example. He's very interested in, do the methods of reproduction that we think about, do they take seriously the body's role in that? And if we don't take seriously the body's role, one could look, for example, to surrogacy. And so surrogacy really denies the importance of gestation for parenthood. Do we turn the products of pregnancy into products, into mere things? So both of them, I think, focus on the human body, its limits as being constitutive of who we are, and our way of thinking about the world, about the law, and about other people has to be grounded in a joyful acceptance, if you like, of our physical dependencies and obligations as defining who we are.
Well, again, you talk about this idea of autonomy, too, and that's very similar to some of the things you said about the rise and triumph of the modern self. And as you pointed out, the commodification of, for example, surrogacy and all the rest. But in the interest of time, let me move on because this one overlaps, and it's the purpose of gender. That comes from this book, The Genesis of Gender. But I love how you point out that when we start talking about women, oftentimes the current hot question is, what is a woman? Really, the more relevant question is, what is a woman for? And once again, that gets back to obligation, doesn't it?
And to the body, obligation in the body. When I interviewed Abby and asked her, Abby, what is a woman? She essentially said to me, a woman is a human being whose physical body is tailored towards the end of gestation and the production of a child. Well, think about that. That's deeply biological, deeply embodied. It's only because we live in a culture where we think of biology as limiting us rather than representing who we are that the question, what is a woman, has become so problematic.
Well, and the difference between the body and the soul, that, can I play on your understanding of biblical studies, sure sounds like Gnosticism to me, and that is the body and the soul are separate, and yet as Christians we should see it unified, shouldn't we?
Absolutely. Thomas Aquinas has a wonderful comment on 1 Corinthians 15 when he says, when you die, your soul goes to be with the Lord. But then he says, but it is not you. It's sort of part of you. But you are a body and soul in unity. And I think a lot of Christians, we tend to think of ourselves as souls who inhabit a body. Body's like a spacesuit. Mm-hmm. I think we need to really emphasize the importance of the theological significance of bodily resurrection for understanding what it means to actually be a human being.
Yes, we'll have resurrection bodies, the new heaven, new earth, certainly very illustrative issues there as well. And so this is a piece which I would highly recommend. I'll warn some of you that complain that sometimes I increase your book spending, because there are 3 of these books that I did not have: The Rights of Women, What It Means to Be Human, and The Genesis of Gender. So be forewarned, but I think these are the kinds of resources we need to have, in addition to the ones that are probably more familiar, like The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis and others. These are great resources. But Dr. Trueman, I thought for just a minute, I haven't done this with you before, but we started the program by talking about the latest college rankings that Manhattan Institute did of public universities. And I said in passing, you might want to first consider Christian colleges, and one of those would be Grove City College. And I thought for a minute, I've never really asked you to talk about that, but there are students who benefit by the fact that you are a professor both of biblical and religious studies at Grove City College.
Yes, indeed. I'm actually on loan to the University of Notre Dame this year.
Yeah, well, that was in the list.
I'm at Grove City. Yeah. Yes, I'm at Grove City College routinely. We have a very solid liberal arts core. And in my 7 or 8 years there, I've seen an increasing spiritual seriousness on campus. So please do, if you're thinking of college, please do at least give Grove some consideration in your plans.
I might just mention, too, that in this list that they talked about here, Notre Dame was on the list. I thought it was pretty intriguing to see that. It was 5th out of their list that was created by Manhattan Institute. And so, again, Grove City College, Manhattan, has done a good job, of course, talking about Notre Dame and some of the other public schools. But check into some of those Christian schools. And if nothing else, thank you for writing this piece. It was more almost like a book report there in World Magazine, but it caught my eye, and any excuse I can use to get you on the program, I always like to do so. So thank you again for your writing, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me on.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, we will get into some of the issue of the Persecuted Church. We have this International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church coming up. Todd Nettleton will be with us. He, of course, is the host of the Voice of Martyrs Radio. He's also Vice President for Message for Voice of Martyrs. And we also have a video that you may want to see. We have it linked there. It is one produced by the Voice of Martyrs, Daniel and Aline, Democratic Republic of the Congo. Of course, we do want to talk about the fact that the mainstream press, the legacy press, has done such a poor job of covering one of the great tragedies of the 21st century, and that is the systematic execution of Christians in Nigeria, the number of churches that have been destroyed, and on and on. So we'll spend some time talking with him about that. And then the last half hour, Star Parker has a very good piece on this issue of welfare over national security. John, does the federal law extend to Portland? Well, we have a governor and a mayor that doesn't think so, but I think he gives us some pretty good justification for that from a legal point of view. Don't forget, of course, our Friday weekend edition will be taking place as well. I think you'll enjoy the conversation with Liberty McCarter and Merrill Matthews. And as you go to the website, you can find out about these articles, these resources, and including my commentary and our Take Action item. It's all available at pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll be back in a few minutes, right after these messages.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you. Now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
Thank you, Kerby. I really appreciate your program. You cover a lot of issues that a lot of us think about, I'm sure. And this is the first time I've ever called in, so I appreciate your input, too.
Oh, I thank God for what you're doing on Point of View. You guys have more influence across this country than I believe any of them in terms of tackling the issues and getting the truth out to Americans. It's getting to the point where truth just is bottled up on every hand. Every time you turn around, there's another big bottleneck against truth. I hope your listeners realize what Point of View is doing and supports Point of View in every possible way you can.
You know, I can't go to Washington. I can't do those things. So the only way that I can help is the way that God has provided for me, and to give some of that back to you guys. So, like you said, partnering with Point of View, because, you know, you can't do it alone. Thank you very much for what you guys do. Believe me, it's a needed thing, and I just hope everybody certainly would get on the bandwagon with you.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to spend some time talking about the Persecuted Church. First of all, the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church, November 2nd. So make sure that your church actually uses that as a way to involve many members of your congregation into praying for the church and understanding what is going on. Certainly do want to talk about the failure, if we want to be honest, of the mainstream press and even covering, for example, the slaughter of Christians in Nigeria, the burning down of churches. It's gotten bad when Bill Maher talks about this, who is an atheist and a liberal, and uses that as an illustration. We also have a video that you may want to watch that was produced by Voice of the Martyrs. That's on YouTube. We'll get into that as well. And to really just kind of cover all these different topics, Todd Nettleton joins us once again. He's Vice President for Message for Voice of the Martyrs. He's, of course, the host of the Voice of the Martyrs radio. Spent more than a quarter of a century there as well, and author of the book, When Faith is Forbidden, 40 Days on the Front Lines with Persecuted Christians, and that came out a number of years ago. Todd, welcome back to Point of View.
Thanks so much. It's good to be back with you.
Well, let's get the date first, and I want everybody to mark their calendar, because this is an opportunity, if not on that Sunday, maybe before or after, to really spend some time talking about the persecuted church. We are to pray for those who are being persecuted, and it is an opportunity at least once a year, if not all the time, to be praying for persecuted Christians. So tell us more.
Yeah, International Day of Prayer for Persecuted Christians. Typically, we honor that on the first Sunday in November. But like you say, if you've already planned your service on that Sunday, well, hey, pick the 9th of November, pick the 16th. The important thing is every church praying for our persecuted brothers and sisters around the world. And I like to remind people this is not something, an idea that Voice of the Martyrs came up with. It's not like a marketing plan for us. This is the first request of our persecuted brothers and sisters. The first thing they ask us to do is to pray for them. That's the genesis of the International Day of Prayer for Persecuted Christians. It's what they're asking us to do. And the other thing I like to remind people is that they're not asking us to pray that they won't be persecuted anymore. Instead, they're asking us to pray that they will be faithful in spite of persecution, in spite of the suffering that they face. That's what we want to pray for on this International Day of Prayer for Persecuted Christians.
Let me just mention that some people might think, well, then what do I pray? Well, the good news is there's a free copy of the Voice of the Martyrs Global Prayer Guide with your gift. And, of course, we have a link right now to persecution.com. You can go to the Global Prayer Guide, and you can begin to see the countries which are restricted, those which are hostile, those which are monitored. I was just in a meeting this morning with an individual from Belarus, which is more in the gray, the monitored, but hearing some of the things they can or cannot do was just a reminder that even there, they're facing the kind of persecution that most of us would balk at. And then when you look at what is taking place right now, for example, in Africa, in the Middle East, and in Asia, what is happening in a lot of these Muslim countries, what are happening in communist countries, you can begin to see the importance. So again, if people are looking for material that they can use on November 2nd, you have that material available at Voice of the Martyrs, don't you?
We do. As you mentioned, persecution.com. And one of the things we do each year is we do a short film that you can show in a Bible study group, you can show into your congregation on that Sunday morning. And the idea of the film is simply to put a face on the people that we're praying for. Like you say, sometimes we don't know, well, how do I pray? What do I pray for? This year, that film focuses on the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And I know you're aware of the massive violence that is happening against Christians on the continent of Africa. One of those places is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And so to be able to see, and it's not gory, it's not something you couldn't show to a child, but it does illustrate what they are facing. And the focus of this particular video is how Christian workers, some of them sponsored by the Voice of the Martyrs, are coming alongside Christians who have been through that terrible, violent persecution and are trying to put their lives back together and even trying to put their emotions back together, trying to heal from the trauma that they've endured, and how Christians are coming alongside them and saying, hey, I want to pray with you. I want to stand with you. I want to help you process that trauma and keep going forward in your relationship with Christ and in your life. So it's a great way to kind of identify, how are we going to pray? Well, let's watch this video. Let's think about what our brothers and sisters are going through, and then that will help us as we follow Hebrews 13:3. Remember those in prison, remember those who are suffering as if you were there with them. So if we think about, well, what if I was in that circumstance? What would I want people to pray? That's how we can pray for these brothers and sisters.
Let me just mention that we do have a separate link so you can watch it right now. It's about 5 minutes long, and it really tells the story of two of these Christians who are really trying to bring kind of hope and healing to their fellow believers, and they've dealt with, violence and kidnapping and all sorts of loss, and any place where you might be dealing with something that could be scary, it's just a picture. But then the videos really just tell the story of trying to bring hope and healing. So this is, in a sense, bringing you right to the Congo, the Republic of the Congo, to see what these individuals are doing right now to reach out to others.
Yeah, that is exactly right. This is happening right now, and it's one of the things we want to help persecuted Christians with a blanket and a warm meal and make sure they have a roof over their head. But we also want to help them recover spiritually and emotionally and reach a point of wellness and reach a point of moving forward in their walk with Christ. And so this is a part of pursuing that kind of healing, as well as Bibles and blankets and warm meals and the other aid that Voice of the Martyrs delivers. Let me just take a break, and when we come back, I wanted to get into a couple other issues. First of all, of course, you've heard me talk about Nigeria. I thought I'd get your thoughts on that. One of the things, if you go to persecution.com, and I encourage you to do that during the break, is a whole section on support Christians under communist oppression, and that's one of their features right now. They also, of course, as I mentioned just a minute ago, have this video, so you can actually watch that right now. You can also, of course, get a copy of their global prayer guide. You can find out more about how to pray for the persecuted Christians and do all sorts of other things. There are some great resources you might want to check out as well on the website. There's some books that we have certainly recommended in the past that all fit into that category. So again, I would encourage you to go to persecution.com and find that. Or if you simply go to the website pointofview.net, you'll see the picture of Todd Nettleton, and scroll down. That first particular issue is, of course, the video, and actually during the break you could almost watch most of it, and then underneath it is the Voice of Martyrs Global Prayer Guide. Very important, and one more time, mark your calendar, November 2nd. And as Todd said, well, if for some reason you can't do it on November 2nd, well, how about November 9th or 16th, whatever it might be. Those are great opportunities to really mobilize the church to pray for the persecuted church, which is, of course, undergoing all sorts of persecution and violence and recrimination and the rest. So we'll take a break, come back and get into a couple other short aspects of that with Todd Nettleton of Voice of the Martyrs. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A new study of marijuana is in the news, and since we dislike people who tell you, "I told you so," I'll merely remind radio listeners that we've had this conversation before. The editors of the Wall Street Journal write that marijuana users are crash dummies. They cite research from Wright State University that analyzed driver autopsy results of car crashes. More than 4 in 10 tested positive for THC, the active ingredient in marijuana, with an average level of 30 nanograms. This is more than 6 times the level most states use to define impairment. As you may already know, breathalyzers used by law enforcement don't detect recent marijuana use. That makes it difficult for police to catch a person who is driving while high. The editors also remind us of the fact that today's marijuana is 5 times more potent than the weed that boomers smoked when they were young. The editors also mention that auto fatalities have increased over the last decade, even as cars have become safer and alcohol consumptions have fallen. You might want to look at the individual states and find what appears to be a correlation. As I've mentioned in previous commentaries, just as various governments are rushing to legalize and thus increase marijuana use, we're also learning more of its dangers. A decade ago, when I had a reporter on my program who documented the link between cannabis and schizophrenia, I received many complaints from the audience. Now the National Institute of Health is reporting the same connection. A rational society would debate both the pros and cons of a policy. Unfortunately, the negative concerns about marijuana use are mounting up, and yet few seem to be paying attention. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Todd Nettleton with us for a few more minutes. Let me again encourage you to mark November 2nd for the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church. But Todd, I thought for just a few minutes we might talk about, as we were talking about Africa and the Congo, what has been happening in Sudan, as what has been happening in certainly Nigeria. And I was thinking that the failure, if you will, of even the legacy media, the mainstream press, is an illustration of why I would encourage people to support Voice of the Martyrs and why we want to have you on a regular basis. Because, as I said, when even a liberal atheist, Bill Maher, is shocked that the press isn't even talking about the whole-scale elimination, if you will, of Christians in Nigeria, the burning down of the churches, the killing and slaughter of Christians, it seems to me that that's all the more reason why people need to make sure they get your magazine and donate to what you're doing, because you're calling us out to remind us of what has been happening in some of these countries.
Yeah, it's not very often that I cheer on Bill Maher and what he's saying, but when he's saying, hey, we need to pay attention to what's happening to Christians in Nigeria, it's like, yeah, keep talking. Let's go. Because it is a story that is not understood. It is a story that's not told in our secular media. And as you say, the Voice of the Martyrs, every month we send out a free magazine that tells people what's happening in the world with our brothers and sisters, where they are suffering. But it's not just sort of reporting about what is happening and what suffering is going on. It's reporting about what God is doing in the midst of that suffering. And, you know, we see amazing, courageous Christians in Nigeria. I think of one pastor that we are working with who is in such a dangerous place in northern Nigeria that he told his wife and his kids, you guys need to get out of here. It's not safe for you. He sent them to another village about 3 hours away where they could be safer, but he chose to stay in that dangerous village. And his reasoning was, listen, if I leave, what's going to happen to my flock? What's my congregation going to say if their pastor says it's too dangerous, I got to go? I'm going to stay here, and God has called me here, and when God calls me to leave, that's when I'll leave. I'm not going to leave because Boko Haram says I should leave. I'm going to wait until God calls me to leave. And so that's the way Christian pastors are responding, even in the face of grave danger, literally life-threatening danger. They are saying, hey, I want to serve the Lord. I want to do what he's called me to do.
Well, again, as you mentioned, this is Boko Haram, which has had all these targeted attacks on civilians, security personnel. Of course, they destroyed so much, but oftentimes it's just passed off as, a civil war. Of course, with Sudan, it's the difference between the farmers and the ranchers or something of that nature. And for us as Christians, we need to understand that there is a bigger issue there, that there are principalities and powers and forces of darkness, and that's why a lot of that is taking place.
Yeah, there is some aspects of sort of tribal animosity. There are aspects of that filter into some of this violence. But when you see the attackers go into a village and the homes of Christians are all burned down and the homes of Muslims are all left standing, it's like, wait a minute, that's not about, herders versus farmers. The Christian homes were burned and the Muslim homes were left alone. That is targeting Christians. That is persecution. And so it's important to kind of understand the whole scope. And thankfully, at Voice of the Martyrs, we have people on the ground. We have people who will go to that village after the attack and say, hey, what happened here? Who was affected? How can we help? I so admire our international ministry staff who literally put their lives on the line to go and stand with persecuted Christians, even right after an attack like that.
Are there some things we can do for those individuals that have been affected? I mean, there's a place on your website where it says stand with persecuted Christians and to serve and things of that nature, to give. What are some of the options? Because we've been talking about prayer, but I also want people to give not only their prayers, but to give their financial resources. What can be done?
Yeah, Voice of the Martyrs is actively working in northern Nigeria, in DRC, in all across the continent of Africa where this persecution is happening. And our international ministry work usually falls into one of three buckets. And I would say almost always falls into one of three buckets. The first is persecution response, where, hey, your home was burned down. You need a place to stay tonight. Like you need a roof over your head. That's persecution response. The second area is Bibles. Each year we deliver more than 1 million Bibles into the hands of Christians inside restricted nations and hostile areas. And then the third area is what we call frontline ministry, and that is pastors and evangelists and church planners, giving them the tools and the training and the encouragement they need to continue advancing the gospel, even in the face of persecution, even in places where they are likely to be persecuted. And so when people give to support Voice of the Martyrs, that's what they're supporting. That's the work that we do in these 70-plus nations.
Again, if you go to persecution.com, scroll down to a part on impact. Again, 1.25 million Bibles distributed every year, 8,500 frontline workers equipped, 4,000 displaced Christians. And if you scroll down, you'll see some of the resources. And Todd, I thought I might just once again encourage people to get your book, When Faith is Forbidden, 40 Days on the Front Lines with Persecuted Christians. It is published by our good friends at Moody, and it came out years ago, but it's still very relevant. And for people that want to make sure that November 2nd begins with certain ideas to present what is taking place, that would be a good starting point. And as you pointed out, this particular video that you put together, it's about 5 minutes long. The Democratic Republic of Congo gives really a great story, and I would think an encouraging story for individuals who would then be motivated to pray or to give.
Yeah, it is an encouraging story, and I'm thankful you mentioned my book. My book is 40 encouraging stories, 40 of the most powerful stories that I've heard in face-to-face conversations with persecuted Christians, and we have at Voice of the Martyrs lots of those stories, and They are powerful to help us understand how to pray as we approach the International Day of Prayer for Persecuted Christians. They're also powerful for us as an inspiration. If my brothers and sisters in Nigeria are willing to risk their lives to advance the gospel, to share Jesus with their neighbors, am I willing to risk an awkward conversation to advance the gospel where I'm at?
Yes.
I think these stories are pretty challenging for us.
Yes. Well, again, it's persecution.com. We have information about the day of prayer. We have information about the prayer guide, which is there, the Voice of the Martyrs Global Prayer Guide, and I would encourage you to use that. And then, of course, we have a link as well to the particular video that you might want to watch. So there are some great resources. And, of course, you have a whole section here in Support Christians Under Communist Oppression. And I appreciate that because I've begun to realize that even though we focus most of our time and attention on the Muslim persecution of Christians, we still are dealing with certain communist countries where Christians find themselves facing persecution as well, don't we?
Yeah, I think of Cuba just 90 miles off our coast. We think of China, over 1 billion people, including some estimates over 120 million Christians. In several dozen have been arrested just this month in China.
Right.
We might think communism is dead, but our friends in China, our friends in Cuba certainly would tell us, no, it's alive and well and persecuting the followers of Christ.
Yes, some of those home church pastors disappear, literally just disappear, and we don't know where they are, although we think we know. Well, Todd Nettleton, I appreciate the great service that you have provided all these years. I appreciate the material that we have posted on our website that you have made available, and I would encourage people to take action, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me. It's always fun to have a conversation with you.
We are going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into some other issues, but don't forget that November 2nd date is one I hope that you'll take advantage of. And, of course, we have some take action items on that regard, which are still available to you, so a lot of great resources there as well. Let me just mention that tomorrow we'll get into some more of these topics with our roundtable discussion, and that's going to be an opportunity for you then to have access to more of these articles. We certainly have the one about the college rankings. We have the one about AI. We have the one about human beings. And, of course, the video that we just talked about that was created by Voice of the Martyrs on the Democratic Republic of Congo. And when we come back, I thought we'd hear from our friend. Haven't had her on the program in a while, but we'll hear from her in terms of her column by Star Parker, Welfare Over National Security. And then I thought this was interesting. It's so funny. John, you actually said, does federal law extend to Portlandia, which, of course, is a TV show, but of course he means Portland, and also Chicago. Are there legal justifications for what the president is doing right now? You wouldn't think so if you listen to some of the progressive or liberal press. But let's go back and try to clarify some of that constitutionally right after these messages.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult. And that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let's see if we can get into a piece that I've posted by Star Parker, a good friend of this ministry, an individual that we've had on the program many times before, and did a great endorsement of Point of View a couple of years ago when we had our 50th anniversary banquet. She has a piece here which has the title, Democrats Prioritize Welfare Over National Security. This gets into, of course, some really important issues. The other day, you might remember, we talked about the fact that, okay, we still have a shutdown taking place. And as a reminder, if you haven't taken action, we still have our Prevent the Government Shutdowns Act of 2025. We need to stop this political pandering and all sorts of clown show that is taking place right now at the nation's capital. But whether it's done by Republicans or Democrats, we don't need that. We need to end this. But more importantly, the Republicans said, okay, we can't seem to come to an agreement here. We had a clean CR, continuing resolution, passed by the House, and we have an unwillingness on the part of the Senate, at least to find 60 votes. We need some more Democrats to join with the Republicans to get the 60 votes to move forward. And as a result, can we then just maybe do something simple, and that is let's fund the federal government's aspect of the military, because it really is, I think, even more unconscionable that though members of Congress might be receiving their paycheck, federal workers will not be receiving their paycheck, and even those in the military will not. And so something needs to be changed. And of course, as you heard the other day, that went nowhere. And so, again, she starts by quoting from the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, who we've had on the program before, really like him, and I think he is a very measured individual. But the other day he was on ABC's This Week with Jonathan Karl, in which he made some strong statements, and Jonathan Karl challenged him on it. But he said, look, I'm concerned about these No King rallies, because this just illustrates what he called the rise of Marxism in the Democratic Party. He says, just look at what's happening in New York. They're about to elect an openly socialist Marxist as the mayor of America's largest city. And also did note that this is not only an individual that may be elected, but has been endorsed by the governor, a Democrat of the state of New York, Kathy Hochul. And if you wonder about that, let me hold up my book on a biblical point of view on socialism. Years ago, we did a biblical point of view on capitalism and socialism, and I thought it would be good just to focus on this issue of socialism itself in terms of facts and arguments, because one on capitalism was more socialist arguments against capitalism, this one on socialism. And as she points out, if you look at the latest Gallup poll, two-thirds, 66% of Democrats said they have a positive view of socialism, compared with 42% say they have a positive view of capitalism. Now, among Republicans, it's just reversed. 74%, or three-fourths of Republicans, have a positive view of capitalism. Only 14% have a positive view of socialism. As you well know, and one of the reasons I put this booklet out, and we have another one coming out, which is going to be based on the book, The Road to Socialism, The Road to all sorts of other very dangerous kinds of things, is because once we look at this Road to Serfdom by F.A. Hayek is, I think, a good illustration of why we need to do more and more education, especially for the younger generation. So that's just kind of a preview of a book that's coming out in the future. But then she goes on to then spend most of her time talking about the military issue, and said that Republicans wanted to extract the Defense Department, now called the War Department, from all of this and advance a separate bill to fund the Defense Department, now called the War Department, for a year. And that, as you know well, we've already said, went nowhere. Well, then she reminds us of what we are dealing with right now. And for those of you that are in the military, we feel for you. If you have young people that are maybe serving in the military right now that are part of your family, they are well aware of this. But Let's just use what she has posted in the latter 2 pages of her commentary. The first is that the Government Accounting Office, that's called the GAO, issued a scathing report on the state of military readiness of Army and Marine Corps ground vehicles. This would be tanks, self-propelled artillery, and armored personnel carriers. According to the report, since fiscal year 2015, mission-capable rates declined for 16 of 18 vehicles we reviewed. Then you have in the Navy, first of all, this she quotes from a report that was in Business Insider, but in the story about the Navy, it says it is bogged down by shipbuilding struggles and maintenance woes. On the other hand, China, according to the report, has the largest navy in the world and is building new warships at a faster pace than the United States. Do you think they're headed for some kind of conflict? And she then reminds us of a famous quote from Ronald Reagan, who observed, "We know only too well that war comes not when the forces of freedom are strong, but when they are weak. It is when the tyrants are tempted." And so again, at a time when we recognize that the military probably needs more than just the paychecks that need to go to the military, it needs some kind of commitment to the military, we seem to be falling behind, and that is a source of concern. So then she turns her attention in the last page or so to, well, why did we deal with this in the first place? And you see many of the people in leadership in the Democratic Party making the really powerful case. They believe that indeed these enhanced subsidies of Obamacare need to be implemented because if nothing else, those enhanced subsidies are going to be necessary for people to pay for health care. Which, of course, leads us to one of the great lines that I've seen more than a few people post on X, and that is, you know what? The Affordable Care Act was never affordable, and now it's even less affordable. There's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, the cost of medical technology has increased dramatically, partially because we have much more sophisticated medical technology than we've ever had before, but partially also because the dollar has been declining every single year. Conversations we had even yesterday on the roundtable, the Next Generation Roundtable, about the unaffordability of houses, or even something which is being used right now by the mayoral candidate in New York of affordability in New York City is due to the declining dollar values. And so as a result, medical care is more expensive all the time because of the way we misallocate some of those resources, and also due to the fact that medical care is more expensive. People are living longer, so thus more opportunity for debilitating diseases. And I think the biggest issue is the value of the dollar has been declining for decade after decade after decade. So she then goes and points out that according to the Cato Institute, the Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Enhanced subsidies that Democrats want to restore, they said, quote, are a costly reminder of how temporary government programs can become billion-dollar permanent entitlements. So then she starts using their analysis to run the numbers. If indeed Republicans in the Senate decide to cave and say, okay, we will extend those subsidies, which were supposed to be temporary during the pandemic, if we do so, what's the cost? Get out your calculators, everybody. Here they are. This would increase the deficit by $350 billion over 10 years. It would increase overall spending by more than $488 billion, and it would increase the interest costs by an additional $60 billion, all because of these temporary subsidies, which were removed for some time, and that's because Those subsidies went to people who were, 400% above the poverty spending cap. Some 1/3 of those individuals with incomes over 400% over the poverty line. And as a result, the argument in this article she quotes from Cato Institute was the enrollment fraud is rampant, with more than 6.4 million improper enrollees, which are costing the taxpayers $27 billion a year. So you can begin to see that she has taken the time to talk about everything from welfare to socialism to national security, which is why I wanted to make that available to you. As an individual who at one time was a single mother on welfare, she speaks of this with great conviction and with a great deal of insight. And I thought this article might be helpful if you're involved in a conversation with somebody who is just really upset that the government is shut down because the Republicans won't give these enhanced subsidies to the people that so deserve them. This gives you the other side of the story. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
As this program winds down today, I thought I'd pick up just two pieces that might be of interest. One is by John Yo, and he is an individual that has been that at the University of California at Berkeley Law School has been a fixture for many years. Now, as I see in this particular article, he also is professor of the School of Civic Leadership at the University of Texas at Austin. And, of course, he's a professor of law at the University of California at Berkeley, and also supervises the public law and policy program and all sorts of other things. He's very well credentialed, and I wanted to at least try to provide for those of you that are interested the legal justification for what President Trump is doing. Again, I think sometimes people wonder whether or not there is a legal justification. Is this just something that President Trump is doing because he's trying to rattle the cages of the Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson, or to try to challenge, for example, Governor Tina Kotek of Oregon, or whatever? And I think there are some very good reasons why, indeed, he has wanted to send in the National Guard. But what is the constitutional basis? And again, quoting from an individual that is a conservative who looks at the Constitution in terms of its original intention, so that we are not going to just read rights into the Constitution that are not there. I think he does a very good job. The title of this, and you can read it for yourself because it is more of a legal document, and I'll try not to get in the deep weeds too much, but I think it is a good example of a question that is a legitimate question and deserves a legitimate and thoughtful answer. So here goes. Does the federal law extend to Portlandia? Okay, right off the bat, he's having a little bit of fun with them, but saying that the president can use the military to protect federal facilities and federal personnel carrying out legitimate federal functions. That should be so obvious that we shouldn't even have to read this piece that goes on for a couple pages. But I will engage in a brief summary. This is going to be more like the Cliff Notes. Remember the Cliff Notes in high school? I'm going to try to take a legal document and break it down. He says, first of all, when you look at the reaction, he starts with Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson, who claims, quote, the right wing in this country wants a rematch of the Civil War. Well, John Yoo says, well, in one thing he's right, because in some respects he's doing it in a way that would have shocked the state's most favored son, Abraham Lincoln, because the mayor of Chicago and the governor of Illinois, J.B. Pritzker, he says, are relying on discredited theories that were promoted by what? First the Confederates in the Civil War, and then by the segregationists to unconstitutionally resist federal authority. We've said that before, but I thought it was kind of fun to mention once again. And so then he goes through and talks about the fact that we've seen violent protests outside of federal buildings in Portland and Chicago. We've seen attacks in both Portland and Chicago on ICE and Department of Homeland Security agents. We've also seen in Portland and Chicago organized efforts to block the enforcement of immigration law. Okay. He goes on to point out that just looking at, say, Article 2 of the Constitution, which places on the president the duty to take care that the laws are faithfully executed, really should be enough. But let's recognize that we have governors, J.B. Pritzker in Illinois, Tina Kotek in Oregon, that have sued the White House and in some respects have met with what you might call mixed success in some of the courts. For example, Thursday of last week, the Federal Court of Appeals in the Seventh Circuit upheld a lower court barring Trump administration from deploying the National Guard in Illinois. This is where I think ultimately there's going to be a need somewhere along the line for the Supreme Court to step in. Once they do, I think some of those will be set aside. But he then goes on to explain, okay, the decisions in the Chicago courts, because he goes through a couple of others, appeals courts and all the rest, that fail to properly interpret what he says is the broad discretion delegated by Congress to the president. Well, what would that be? Well, again, get out your Constitution. That is Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which vests in the Congress the power to provide for the calling for the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. And so this would be the providing even for the organizing, arming, and disciplining of the militia. And a unanimous Supreme Court held that Congress enjoys what is called the plenary authority over the National Guard and could set the conditions for calling them into national service. So under this authority, he argues, Congress has established several grounds for the president to deploy troops domestically. And in Title 10 of the U.S. Code, Congress even delegated to the president the authority to call the National Guard in cases of invasion, rebellion, and resistance to federal law. Even if you want to argue, and some have, Portland and Chicago and some of these courts have argued, well, this is not an invasion, this is not a rebellion, but there's another particular issue there, resistance to federal law. And he says the Democrats conveniently ignore that third ground to call out the National Guard. The Congress allows the president to federalize the National Guard when he is unable with the regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. And so again, the question is, yes, but then they're coming to take over. No, he argues against that as well. He says it is not the case of the federal troops displacing local police or even assuming general law enforcement powers. Chicago and Portland have not yet descended into a total breakdown of order, which we did see in Los Angeles. I'm old enough to remember the 1992 Rodney King riots. So in this case, in 2025, the federal government and the Trump administration is not replacing the state's responsibility to maintain public safety. Instead, it's enforcing federal law. And we have a case called Arizona versus United States in 2012, in which the Supreme Court hold that only federal officials can enforce it. That had to do with the issue of immigration. And so then he comes down to, we hold it to be the incontrovertible principle that the government of the United States may, by means of physical force, exercise through its official agents, execute on every foot of American soil the powers and functions that belong to it. And President Trump could expand the military's mission beyond protecting the federal government to include law enforcement when there is organized resistance to the attempt to actually deal with federal law, and when they're particular with organized resistance trying to obstruct the execution of the federal law. So again, the argument that's being made that the president doesn't have the authority to call out the troops fails to understand also just one example from history, and that is, remember in the 1950s, maybe you weren't there, but certainly the history books will remind you that in the case of Brown versus Board of Education, and then the rights of civil rights protesters, there were a number of times in which it was required, first of President Eisenhower, later of President Kennedy, and then even of President Johnson, to actually do what we are asking them to do today. I know that's a lot, but if you want to read it, you can see that, again, the president is within his constitutional right to do what he's doing. Some of the courts are wrong, and sooner or later, I think they'll be overturned. It's been a long day, and we've covered a lot of issues, but we certainly have a lot more to cover tomorrow on our Friday weekend edition. I want to thank Megan for her help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. by the fact you're here listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
Okay. Two more, and as soon as you're ready, hate to put you on